All right, it's not letting me do it on Twitter, but that's fine. Okay, I believe we are live here. Let me just make sure. Okay, so welcome to a sort of special episode stream on my channel, Thinking Islam, and today we have a special guest who's going to join us for a discussion. We have Dr. Stephen Nemes. Welcome, Dr. Nemes. How are you today?
I'm well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
So basically, there's been a lot of chit chat in the last week about the Trinity. There's been debates about the Trinity between different people. And every time the Trinity is talked about, the friendly resident Thomists join the discussion. And there's a particular Thomist who goes on Twitter by Walmart Thomist. And he shops at the Walmarts that sell things that don't have any parts. And he's known as Christian Wagner, and he put out an interesting video yesterday explaining the Trinity from a Thomist perspective, obviously meant to clarify a whole bunch of things that were said in the past few weeks, because you had William Lane Craig with a very sort of odd Trinity model debating Muhammad Hijab, and the Thomists are, as they should be, the Thomists were very keen on clarifying that their model of the Trinity is different and doesn't run into all the problems that William Lane Craig models runs into. So what we're going to do today is we're going to play some of the comments and explanations that Walmart Thomist / Christian Wagner shared last night. And Dr. Stephen Nemes, who's written an entire book, part of which critiques the Trinity from a metaphysical perspective, he's going to offer some comments, feedback, counter arguments, and the basic thesis that Dr. Nemes is going to advance, which I agree with, is that one cannot hold to the doctrine of divine simplicity, in which, you know, God is absolutely simple without any distinctions, and also hold to the Trinity. Especially the Thomist version. So that's the thrust of what we're doing here today. So, Stephen, shall we just begin with the video clips, and then you can sort of comment?
Sure.
All right. So the first 10 minutes of I don't know what to call him. I don't know if he goes by Christian Wagner or Walmart Thomist, but we'll call him by his YouTube channel. So the first 10 minutes of Scholastic Answers YouTube video, we're just presenting definitions of like what a relation is. So I'm going to sort of skip that part, and we're going to get to when he starts applying this framework to God, and that starts around 11:45. So let's just play, and Stephen, you can just tell me to sort of pause at any point, and we can sort of get your input.
I can't hear it, by the way.
Oh, let me check that then. Let me re-share that. Okay, let's try it again.
We went over above, there are three aspects to a relation. There is the subject, there's the terminus, and there's the foundation. So obviously, if we wanted to discuss the persons, and the persons are based on the relations, we're going to want to start out with the foundation. So we're going to start with foundation, and then we're going to go to relation, and then we're going to go to persons. This is exactly what St. Thomas does. In question 27, he looks at the foundation, and the foundation is some sort of act, which is procession. Question 28, he looks at real relations. And in question 29 and following, he looks at personhood. This is very important. Starting with the foundation, As we covered above, there are two possible foundations for a real relation. On the one hand, it can be quantity, and on the other hand, it can be a certain action. Now, we know that God obviously does not have quantity, because quantity is necessarily going to be in reference to some sort of extension, and obviously God isn't somehow extended. Further, quantity follows upon the material aspect of something, and there's no material aspect to God. So obviously, we're not going to be able to found relation on that. But can we found it on action? So in order to consider whether it can be found on action, we need to look at the two types of action that an agent can have. On the one hand, action can be transient. Transient action is action that goes outside of the agent. So, for example, if I pick up a ball and throw it, that is transient action. Now, obviously, transient action cannot be what we're looking for, because nothing that is outside of God can be God. That would be ridiculous. But on the other hand, we can actually look at imminent action. So imminent action is action that happens within the agent, and its terminus does not pass outside of the agent. So, for example, thinking and willing. When I think and I will, and I keep it within myself, that is an imminent action. So possibly, when we're thinking about a relation in God, if there were such a relation, we should be looking not at quantity, that's impossible, not at transient action, that's impossible, but only at imminent action. We've considered all of the possibilities, so the only one left is going to be imminent action. Now we're able to narrow the question down a lot. Rather than simply asking, is there a relation in God, or is there some sort of foundation for relation, we're able to ask the particular question, is there something in God which could provide the foundation for relation in being an imminent act? Now, does God have imminent acts? It's a great question. Well, God has two faculties which are capable for imminent acts. God has an intellect and God has a will. So he has these faculties which are able.
All right.
I think this is one of the points where especially you would want to press him, because if we admit the doctrine of divine simplicity, then we should not say that God has two faculties of imminent action. He is just one pure and simple act. And there may be different ways that we try to make sense of God's one and simple act. There may be different concepts that we apply to God or pictures that we create in our mind for applying to God. But strictly speaking, in God, there is no plurality. There's just the one reality that he is. And so here it seems to me, and you might agree, that Christian is taking for granted something, some sort of distinction in God that is not actually there, and that will undermine his approach.
Yes, I would. That will, when I heard this last night, and I think I sent you a message about this. That was my first thought. So if we say God has two faculties, but God is simple, God cannot have two faculties, right? At most, you could say God has one faculty, but then divine simplicity would force you to further say that God's faculty is identical to God. So you're just, when you say God has two faculties, divine simplicity would reduce it to simply saying God is himself. That's it. So I'm not sure. And again, if somebody says, well, the intellect and will of God are only distinct for creatures, I would say, okay, but then that's just a distinction in creaturely minds, in our creaturely concepts. But in extramental reality, God cannot be said to have two faculties, one intellect and one will. So yeah, I would agree with that. But again, from what's going to happen in the video is that Christian is going to say that by virtue of these two faculties, and I don't know what kind of distinction he's going to have to posit for them, but they can't have a real distinction. You are going to have two emanations, which is the foundation. He calls it procession. So if we rewind it back, he actually had a good sort of thing over here. So the foundation for what's going to be these relations or persons in God, the foundation are processions. So God has two immanent processions, right? That's what he's saying. So I sort of tried to diagram this out, and I'll put this on here. So, and this is actually how I sort of teach it. So you have a divine essence that's absolutely simple. that there's no parts, and again, if God is absolutely simple, as far as I'm concerned, there should be no distinctions internal to God. You just can't have that. If you posit distinctions that are even internal to God, then I would apply that trap argument that I give to the Sunnis. I would apply it to the Thomists. I would say, okay, so you have God, and then you have something that's distinct from God. It doesn't matter how you want to label the distinction. That distinction is either going to depend on God, or God is going to depend on the distinction, and you're going to sort of fall off. So you have the divine essence, and then you have the divine essence, I guess, virtually speaking. You have this Father, right? This they even said this on the stream this morning, that like there's like a virtual emanation from the divine essence, which is the Father. I don't think Thomas actually says that, but that's what they said this morning, and Christian and the team seem to agree with it. So somehow the Father virtually emanates from the divine essence. So now you have the Father, and again, the Father is like sort of intellect and will, even though they're supposed to be the same thing. And then you have the first procession, which is the Word, and then you have the second procession, which is the Holy Spirit. So already here, it seems to me that now, because you're calling these imminent acts, right? Like the procession of the Son is an imminent act. The procession of the Holy Spirit is an imminent act. So now we do have distinction within the divine essence. And at this point, I would say it doesn't seem God is simple anymore.
No, I agree with you entirely. I think a lot of people, because they are approaching the question of divine simplicity already within the dogmatic structure of Christianity, they don't understand really what exactly is meant by simplicity, and they don't understand how things that ordinary sort of Catholic Christianity says about God are incompatible with it. If you read, for example, in Plotinus, or if you read in other Eastern sources, when they talk about the simplicity of the ultimate principle, they make it clear that you cannot say anything about it. You cannot attribute distinctions into it. If there are distinctions or different words that we use about it, it's strictly on our side, right? There are different concepts, but the thing itself that we refer to is absolutely simple and without any sort of internal differentiation whatsoever. Now, you cannot say that something that is absolutely simple and without any internal differentiation whatsoever also has these distinct processes going on within it, because then you've differentiated it, and that much is clear. Sometimes people seem confused, and they say, well, no, it's not as if the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit are parts of God in the way that, like, my car has various parts. But there's a confusion here about what is meant by part. We don't only use the word part to refer to removable pieces of things. Like you can remove, for example, the engine out of a car. We also use the word part to remove the thing, to refer to the internally differentiated aspects of a thing, which cannot be removed from it, strictly speaking. So, for example, we can say that marriage, conflict resolution is a part of marriage. That's a perfectly reasonable and sensible way to talk about it, and that's an intelligible sentence. But it's not as if conflict resolution is some piece of something called marriage that you can just remove just like that. It's not like that. Marriage, as an intellectual object, as a phenomenon that we can consider with our minds, is multifaceted. It has different parts, and one of these parts is conflict resolution. Or think, for example, about the denouement of a story. Right? Every story, sort of by definition, has a denouement if it doesn't just end in its climactic moment. But it's not as if you can remove the denouement from a story. It's not that sort of thing that can just be removed, like you can remove a branch from a tree or anything like that. Rather, the idea is that whenever you grasp a whole with the intellect, and you can differentiate within that whole different aspects, right, that are different from each other, then you don't have something simple. Marriage as a phenomenon is not a simple thing. It's a complicated thing. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It has all these different aspects to it. A story, any story whatsoever, has a beginning and a middle and an end, a denouement, a climax, a preparation for the story, a narrative. These are all different parts of a story. That doesn't mean that a story is a physical thing that you can break up into pieces. So also, if we grasp God as an object for our intellects, and we distinguish in God between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, or these internal processions and all this other stuff, we are clearly undermining his simplicity. We are denying that he's simple when we do all these things, even though we're not talking about removable material parts or anything like that. A clear example for, when you distinguish between matter and form in an object, right? You can use artificial objects. That one's a little complicated. You can also refer to like natural substances, like a human being or a rabbit or whatever. There is a distinction in those things between matter and form. That doesn't mean that you can remove matter from form, but there is still a distinction. There's still an internal differentiation between that which gives a thing intelligibility and that which particularizes it. So when it comes to the simple God, we cannot have those distinctions. We cannot have a distinction between that which particularizes and that which gives intelligibility. We cannot have a distinction between that which proceeds and that which proceeds from, that which is proceeded and so on. That which begets and that's which is begotten, because all of these, if we start talking about the divine nature as having these things within it, then we've compromised its simplicity. So
Yeah,
you have to
had
choose between the
this.
simplicity or the the processions in God and so on.
Yeah, and this was one of your sort of first arguments over here that you had provided. So
Yeah, if you don't mind, let me just read it here. So if the divine essence is absolutely simple, so here's another thing. When Christian describes the Trinity as these subsistent relations in God, all of them having the same SA in, even though they have distinct SA odd. And he says there's no argument to prove that this is impossible. There is a sort of an argument that we can give to show that this cannot possibly be true, but it's not that it entails a contradiction. It's that there is nothing that allows you to make those statements to make them true. So I'll give an example. If the divine essence is absolutely simple, then there is nothing to ground the truth of the assertion that multiple distinct relations subsist in it. Now, why is that? The statement couldn't possibly be true in the same way that it can't be true to say that a rock is in pain or that it enjoys jazz music, because there's nothing there to make the proposition true, right? The rock, considered in itself, does not have anything in it that allows, that would make that proposition true. At best, what could make the proposition true in a case like this is that there is something in the person making the statement. So, for example, when I say that ice cream is delicious, it's not that there is something in ice cream that is deliciousness. It's in me, right? The deliciousness of the ice cream is in me. It's the effect that it has on me. So there is still a way of there's still something that makes that proposition true, the fact that it's delicious to me. But if the God is absolutely simple, then we cannot say that there are multiple distinct processions in God, because there simply is no way to make those statements true. There's nothing there that can make those statements true, right? There is just the simple divine essence, and so you cannot use you can have multiple different relations applicable to it.
yeah, and you gave this sort of example, right? When whatever we predicate of a thing, there must be something about the thing or within the thing that makes the predication true.
Right. So let's imagine, for example, that this black square here with all these shapes in it, that's an object. Okay, and these shapes represent different qualities or properties or whatever you want to call them that belong to that object. There are some things that we can predicate of that object that would be true. For example, a sort of a light blue triangle, that's true. Why is that? Because there's something that corresponds to the predication in the object. The magenta diamond, the golden star, these symbolize different predications, right? What we say about it corresponds to something that's in it. So that's why those predications can be true. But when there is nothing in the object that corresponds to our predication, then they can't be true. They're false. And so also, if we have a simple essence, right, with no internal differentiation whatsoever, there is nothing distinct in the essence. It's just a pure, simple actuality. Then we cannot make multiple really distinct predications of it. We can't say, for example, that there is paternity and filiation and active spiration and passive spiration, because there is nothing in the object that makes those statements true. Now, Christian will try to explain this later on in his video when he says that the procession of intellection produces a representation and so on, and we can talk about that later. But so long as you are talking about absolute simplicity, so long as you're talking about an absolutely simple principle, you cannot say that there is in that absolutely simple principle both paternity and filiation, both active spiration and passive spiration, because the simplicity of the object there's nothing in that to correspond to the diversity of predications made of it. So that's why these statements simply cannot be true.
Now, Thomas, of course, anticipated this sort of objection. This is sort of his reply, right?
Yeah.
To what?
So he says here, whatever proceeds by way of outward procession is necessarily distinct from the source whence it proceeds, whereas whatever proceeds within by an intelligible procession is not necessarily distinct. Indeed, the more perfectly it proceeds, the more closely it is one with the source whence it proceeds. For it is clear that the more a thing is understood, the more closely is the intellectual conception joined and united to the intellectual agent, since the intellect, by the very act of understanding, is made one with the object understood. Thus, as the divine intelligence is the very supreme perfection of God, the divine word is of necessity perfectly one with the source whence he proceeds, without any kind of diversity. Now,
Yeah. So when I read this, it sounds like the Thomist is trying to have his cake and eat it too, right? On one hand, they want to affirm that there is a procession, right, and a proceder, namely
right.
the Father, right? They want to affirm a distinction between the begetter and the begotten. And yet, like right after, then they want to say, yeah, but they're one.
Right. Because it's both the divine essence.
Yeah. So what I mean, it's like they want to have. It seems to me anyway that this is sort of like violating, the law of identity, in a sense, because if you take those things together, if you say that okay, the Father, which is the divine intellect, begets the Son, which is the divine word, but then you also say that the divine word is of necessity perfectly one with the source, hence he, from which he proceeds, without diversity, then will that not just collapse into the the divine essence identical to the Father, like just begets itself?
Well, there are two things here, really. The first part is about this procession. Okay, and Christian talks about this in his video. He says that our intellect is productive, it's fecund, and when we know things by the intellect, we produce an intellectual conception, which corresponds in various ways to the thing that we know, and this thing can be called a conceptional word, whatever. Um,
Do we want to
Notice,
play that? Do we
yeah,
want to
yeah,
play
you
it?
can play that part because it was coming up in the video.
Sure, yeah, I
And I
think,
think it's relevant to this objection that Thomas is
yeah,
discussing here.
let me do that. It's around 15 minutes, which is, yeah, might as well like hear it from him.
So, for example, if I'm looking at a cup and I'm considering cupness, a little cup is produced by my intellect, so I can know the cup through that thing. This is called an intentional image or concept or word.
Can you pause it
Do you
here?
know those ideas?
Strictly speaking, what he's saying is false, because if you do propose a distinction between this production of the intellect and the real object, what is produced by the intellect is not a cup, right? It's like that famous painting, "This is not a pipe," right? Representations are not the things of which they are representations. A mental representation of a cup is not a cup. Um, a mental representation of another person is not that person. It's a representation of that person. Just like a portrait of me or a portrait of my grandfather is not my grandfather, it's a portrait of him. It represents him. And so sometimes, I talk about this a little bit in my Eucharist book, sometimes when we talk about representations, we talk about them as if they are the things which they represent. So we can point at a picture of a person on the wall and say that's George Washington, even though strictly speaking, it's just a canvas with paint on it. It's not actually George Washington. It represents George Washington. So here is where I think there is a confusion and there's a bit of a slippage going on, because what is produced by the intellect in knowing is not the object that is known. It's a representation of the object, which can correspond to a greater or lesser degree depending on how good our knowledge is. Okay, so this is where the problem arises, because the representation is really, it's an accident of our intellect. It's an accident of us, right? It's a property, a sort of activity that our mind undergoes, but it does not produce a separate object. It's just our mind undergoing a certain activity. That's what knowledge produces, representing. So here is where I think there's a major problem. And if you would go back to the slide about Thomas, the reply to objection 2 or whatever, with the one we were just at. Yeah. So he says, the more perfectly an intelligible procession proceeds, the more closely it is one with the source whence it proceeds. What does he mean here? Because this is tricky. in one sense, what he's saying is true. The better a representation is, the more there's a sort of correspondence between that representation and the real object which it represents. Okay, so the better I know something, the more my representation of that object corresponds to what I know. But the representation is not that thing. It's a representation of the thing. So it's distinct, it's numerically distinct. And the representation is in me. It's an accident of mine. It's something happening in me, which has an intentional referent. It's a representation of something else, but it's still something in me. So it is not true that, for example, if you admit that, for example, that I have a representation of the cup, and let's say that I know this cup very well, in that case, my representation is very adequate to the cup, but it is not the cup. It is not one with it ontologically. It's one with it by virtue of adequacy, or some other sort of word like this.
But
So,
Stephen, won't the Thomist simply say that, look, this disparity between the intellectual representation and the object of its intellection, like the cup or the ball or whatever, that this disparity is only true for humans, right? But for God, it's different, because a Thomist, like an Avicennan, would say that God's knowledge of things is actually the cause of the things, right? So like the ball on earth is the effect of God's knowledge of the ball.
mhm.
So in a sense, for God, like to talk about God grasping something through the divine intellect, that conception that God has is going to even be sort of more real than the objects of intellection.
The problem with that response is that it talks about one thing and it calls it knowledge when it isn't that. Okay, so God's causing a ball to exist is his causing it to exist. That is not his knowing the ball. Knowing doesn't occur at all. For example, when I know a ball, I don't cause it to exist. What happens is that my intellect produces a representation of the ball which is adequate. So, of course, here's where another thing is happening, because there's the philosophical language going on, and then there is the dogmatic language, right? Dogmatically, Christian, as a Roman Catholic, is obligated to say that God knows creatures, because of course that's everywhere in the Bible, okay, and that's a philosophical point. But you know as well as I do that in the Neoplatonic tradition and in other traditions which affirm divine simplicity, they deny knowledge of the ultimate principle, precisely because there cannot be this distinction between the knowing intellect and the representation and so on in the ultimate principle. There can't be this distinction. So, strictly speaking, if you want to maintain the simplicity of the absolute principle, you have to deny that it knows and it causes, which is not the same thing as knowing. And you cannot, use a trick of words and say, well, actually, God's knowledge is perfect because it creates. No, that's just not knowledge. That is not knowledge. There's, what knowledge creates is a representation. That's what is created in knowledge, not the real known object. And so you cannot just take the word knowledge and apply it to what God is doing, and all of a sudden the day is saved, because strictly speaking, that's a misuse of language.
Well, let's keep playing what he says, because he'll go on and explain this. But we can already see you disagree with even this sort of intelligible intellection model from the outset. Okay,
can be used to describe this. But whatever it is, we know that our intellect is fruitful. Our intellect produces things within us. Now, we can actually go even further than this. When we consider not something outside of us, but we consider our very selves, we actually produce an intentional image of ourself within us. We produce a concept or word of ourself within us. We actually produce a little accidental self within our intellects. Yet, as I said, this is accidental. My intellect is imperfect. My intellect is limited. So anything that my intellect produces is merely going to be an image or shadow of the reality. It's obviously not going to be the reality itself. I can't just think of a cup and then produce a real cup in my intellect. It's not how it works. But things work slightly differently when we consider God. God doesn't need to produce these concepts in his intellect in order to understand things. God, in his eminence, in his perfection, contains all things within himself in a more perfect mode by the perfection of the divinity. So God merely needs to gaze at himself, and in knowing himself, he can know all things. But we ask that second question. Just like I can know the cup and produce the intentional image of the cup in my intellect, and further, I can know myself and produce the intentional image of myself in the intellect. I can produce a little me in the intellect. What would happen if God, rather than simply considering created things in his own divinity, he actually considered himself? Could there be a fruitful production of a word? Could there be this fruitful production of a concept? Could there be this infinite communication, not merely of intentional being, not merely of a word like in my intellect, not merely of a shadow, an image of the reality, but God in his perfection, rather than being limited like my intellect is, could, in the consideration of himself, he actually communicate his divinity? This communication wouldn't be like my intellect. My intellect, when I consider myself, it's something limited. It's something accidental, something fleeting. This is the divine intellect. The divine intellect would not produce something accidental, shadowy, fleeing, or anything like that. It wouldn't merely communicate intentional being. It would communicate the entirety of the deity.
Okay. Can
It
you
would
pause it here?
produce a word
Well, keep going for just the rest of this sentence.
that is not merely a representation of God. It would produce a word that is God. This,
Okay.
according to Christian theology.
Okay, so
So
so firstly, I'll just say that just to people in the chat. So when you say that, oh, you guys are everything you're saying is a straw man. I mean, what straw man? Like we're playing the video itself. We've had Thomas's own words on the screen. Where's the straw man? Now, if you tell, like, the only thing you could say is that we straw man divine simplicity, but we don't do that. Like, I myself believe in divine simplicity. Dr. Nemes has been an ardent defender of divine simplicity in the past. Like, he knows what the doctrine is. So, look, it's very easy to call something a straw man. But again, like, we're giving our views. So you don't have to agree with our views. You could just shut off YouTube then, and like you can go somewhere else, right? Now on this, I'll just say that to me, what was just said is just like internally inconsistent. So on one hand, we have to believe that the divine intellect, which is God, qua Father, genuinely produces a production. But those are the words he used, right?
right.
Like there's a real production going on here, a product. So the Father is the producer and the Son is the product. Now, I can accept that, like just the idea that God the Father produces a product. I have no problem with that. I have no problem with the product being eternal. But then that product is really distinct from the producer. And if God is simple, then that product must be an eternal creation. And frankly, some of what was said here, somebody like Ibn Sina would accept this. And Ibn Sina would say, yeah, you're talking about the production of the eternal first intellect, right? But then what Christian and the Thomists say is that somehow this product is God. Like the product is identical to the producer. And to me, like, you just can't have it that way unless we want to say that God produced a copy of himself.
Right.
And which would then violate not only divine simplicity, but a whole bunch of other things. So that's sort of my reaction to it.
My problem is that this appeal to the distinction between creator and creature is a red herring. It's entirely irrelevant. The principal issue at hand is that Christian seems to recognize that the activity of the intellect is to produce a representation. Our intellects are feeble and limited, so our representations are never perfectly adequate to their objects. But if God has intellect, his intellect also does not produce a real object, but another representation. And the perfection of God would not imply the reality of an object produced by his intellect, but the perfection of the representation that he has of himself. So, strictly speaking, if God has intellect, he would be perfectly self-knowing. That does not imply that his self-knowledge is another distinct person, or that his knowledge is anything other than a representation. That's all knowledge is. All right. If you accept this view that knowledge is basically the production of representations by the intellect by, for the sake of knowing objects, which the representations refer to, then God's perfect knowledge, or God's knowledge, insofar as he's the creator and he's perfect, would still be a representation. It would not be the being itself that he knows. All right, this is where everything starts to fall apart, because if you think that knowledge works by means of representations, it is never the goal of the intellect to produce a real object. That's not what knowledge is. Knowledge is not producing real objects. Knowledge is producing adequate representations of objects. And so if God has knowledge, then his knowledge also does not produce an object. It does not produce what it knows. It simply produces a perfect representation of what it knows. And so God would perfectly know himself, but his knowledge would still be by means of a representation, and that representation would be distinct from the divine essence itself. It would be a representation of the divine essence, just like, for example, my representation of a cup is distinct from the cup. So I think here there is just a confusion. There's this, I
Is
noticed
this a category error of some kind? So he's starting with a representation model of intellection, and then he's jumping from representation to, a divine person. Like the representation somehow magically becomes a divine person in this case.
Right. Yeah, so I think that's what's going on. The definition of knowledge is changing as we go from human beings to God. For us, knowledge is representational. For God, all of a sudden, knowledge would mean producing something. That doesn't follow, right? Why would that be? This is a point that has to be addressed and explained, and it's not at all obvious. Certainly not to me. It seems to me that if God is perfect and we are imperfect, then that would just mean that his representations are perfect. But that would not mean that his knowledge is productive of what it knows. No knowledge is productive of what it knows. Knowledge is purely representational. It's a matter of the intellects representing to itself perfectly something else outside of him.
Well, in this case, of course, the object of God's knowledge or the object of God's intellection is God, right? It's not the
Yeah.
world, it's God. So God knows himself, and somehow the act of God's self-knowledge produces this product slash image slash son of God, right? That's what they're saying. So the word or the intellectual concept that God conceives as he knows himself, that is the son of God. Now again, I could accept that, but then for me, that intellectual image of God is not God. As
Correct.
you said, it's
Correct.
an image of God. And I have no problem with that in a sense, but then to me, that would just be the first creation, right? There'd be no grounds to call the intellectual image of God, God. Like, I just cannot see how that can be the case, especially because the intellectual image of God is dependent on God. It's dependent actually in two different ways. It's dependent because it's an act of God. So the act is dependent on the agent, but it's also dependent on God because it is an image of God, right? So in this model, what they call the Son of God, as far as I can see, the Son of God is dependent upon God, dependent on the divine essence in at least two different manners of dependence, which just underscores that there seems to be little grounds metaphysically that I can see to turn around and say, okay, the intellectual image of God is the divine essence.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Should we keep playing or should we go to a different part?
Maybe we can skip a little bit further, because I've pretty much said what I wanted to say here. Basically, the function of the intellect is to produce representations, and the perfection of the intellect is the adequacy of the representation, not the production of a real object. That's not what the intellect does. So I've made my point here.
Okay, so then we have some other sort of slide points on this here. So you had another. I don't know if you've said this one already. I guess this is about how the relations. So Christian said this, right? He said the relations in terms of esse in are identical to the divine essence, but the relations with respect to their esse ad are distinct.
Right.
And of course, the relations refer to these actual processions, or the relations come about because of these two processions that we've already talked about. So you had an argument here, so you can just sort of articulate this.
Sure. So another argument that I stated was that relations cannot be really distinct from one another and yet identical to the divine essence. So I'm appealing here to something like Leibniz's law. Now, Thomas addresses this argument in Summa Theologiae, Book 1, question 28, Article 3. But I think that his response fails. So I think if you go to the next slide, you should be able to see this objection. So here's the objection. It would seem that the divine relations are not really distinguished from each other, for things which are identified with the same are identified with each other, right? This is one of Euclid's rules. If two things are identical with a third thing, that are identical to each other. But every relation in God is really the same as the divine essence. So all the relations, strictly speaking, are really the same as the divine essence. Therefore, they're really the same as each other. They're not distinguished from each other. And this is his response. He says this: according to the philosopher, namely Aristotle, this argument holds that whatever things are identified with the same thing are identified with each other, if the identity be real and logical, as for instance a tunic and a garment, but not if they differ logically. Hence, in the same place, he says that although action is the same as motion, and likewise passion, still it does not follow that action and passion are the same, because action implies reference as of something from which there is motion in the thing moved, whereas passion implies reference as of something which is from another. Likewise, although paternity, just as filiation, is really the same as the divine essence, nevertheless, these two, in their own proper idea and definitions, import opposite respects. Hence, they are distinguished from each other. So here I think there is a confusion about the nature of identity. He says, for example, that action is motion and passion is motion. But obviously action is not passion. And this is because there is a logical difference, right? Action means one thing. There's a certain meaning to the word action that is not there in the meaning of the word passion, and so on. But strictly speaking, this is confused because even there is also a real difference between action and passion. For example, if I press down on a bed and form an impression on the surface of the bed, there's something different between my pressing and the bed's being bent downwards by my pressing on it. Okay, so the distinction between action and passion corresponds to a real difference between my action and what the bed is undergoing. So there is a real difference in the state of affairs that corresponds to this difference between action and passion. Now, there's one greater event, which includes my pushing into the bed and the bed's being bent or being pressed down. So that's all one event. But this one event is complex. It's not a simple event. It's a complex event. It has two elements: the active element, my pushing, the passive element, the bread's being pushed. So if you go back then to the first 2 slides ago, action and passion are really distinct, and not only logically so. It's not just that there's a distinction between the words action and passion, as if there's simply a distinction of concepts. There's a real distinction between the acting agent and the passive patient, the thing being acted on. And strictly speaking, although action and passion are motion, they are not simply motion per se. They are species of motion. Action is one kind of motion. Passion is another kind of motion. So there is a real distinction between kinds of motion, and action is one of them, and passion is the other. So Thomas's argument does not really survive here, all right? Because if there is a real difference between paternity and filiation, that must correspond to a real distinction in God between Father and Son. There must be real distinctions in God. But of course, that is incompatible with saying that filiation and paternity, for example, are really identical to the divine essence. They cannot be, all right? If they are really identical to the divine essence, then they are really identical to each other, even though they mean different things, which of course would be impossible. So you cannot say that action and passion are identical, but that's because really there is a difference between the acting and the being acted on. So same thing here. The reason why you can't say that paternity and filiation are the same thing is because there really is a difference between the thing that fathers and the thing that is fathered. They are not the same thing. They are not identical to the same thing.
And then once that follows, this would, if you still affirm the paternity and filiation, it would basically divide the divine essence, right? One part of
Correct.
it will have to be acting, and the other part of it would be the receptacle of that action, right? Because they're just going to say the divine essence is acting on itself. Okay, if the divine essence is acting on itself, then the part that's acting, right, cannot be identical to the part that's receiving,
being acted on,
that's acted on. So that will also, once you affirm both action and passion to the divine essence, i.e. paternity and filiation, and of course they are opposed, then you're going to run into the problem of splitting the divine essence. And of course, if you don't split the divine essence, right, then you're going to run into sort of your third argument over here.
Yeah, here's my third argument. If the simple divine essence is the subject of both paternity and filiation, then the divine essence begets itself. Why is that? Because that which begets the divine essence, the esse in of the begetting, would become prior to that which is begotten. And the being begotten also is the esse in, is the divine essence. So that would make the essence prior to itself, which according to Thomas in his presentation of the five ways is impossible. So the basic idea of the argument is this. Okay, begetting. The begetting, what is it that begets? That's the divine essence, right? That's the thing in which the begetting relation subsists. Now, what is begotten? Also the divine essence, because that is the thing in which the relation of being begotten or filiation subsists. So then you have the same thing being prior to itself. And this is, of course, impossible. Now, I think, so that I think would be the easiest argument here to make. I feel that I'm not explaining myself perfectly clearly, so I want to try again to make sure that we're making something clear. Christian affirms in his video that the esse in and the esse ad are two aspects of a relation. Okay, esse in basically refers to what is it that possesses the relation. In what does that relation subsist? So, for example, if I am the son of my father, the relation of affiliation of being a son that subsists in me. So the esse in is in me. Okay. Now, for the Thomist, the esse in of all the relations, paternity, filiation, active and passive spiration, the esse in of all those is the divine essence, one and the same divine essence, not a part of it, not this part or that part, but one and the same divine essence. Okay. Yeah. Now, if one and the same divine essence is the esse in of all these relations, then the divine essence is the thing that begets. The divine essence is also the thing that is begotten. And that would make it prior to itself, because what is begotten is subsequent to or posterior to what begets. So here I think you have the problem that you have basically the divine essence being prior to itself in virtue of these two relations, which imply relative priority or posteriority inhering in the divine essence.
Yeah, then this here is sort of he provided this summary, right, of what he was arguing. So we can see that over here. And he does say in the video that the esse in is just identical to God's existence or God's essence. So yeah, if the esse in of paternity, filiation, active spiration, and passive spiration, if their esse in are all identical to God, then God is simultaneously like begetter and begotten, right?
Correct.
Which entails sort of what the argument you're making here. All right, and then we go to your fourth point.
So one of the arguments that Christian makes why why relations with distinct esse ad could belong to the same subject, why they could have the same esse in, is that relations do not modify their subjects. Okay, so that's one of his principal arguments. And in response, I would say that some relations do not modify or determine their subjects, but other ones do. The ones that do not modify their subjects are called Cambridge relations in contemporary philosophy. For example, if say somebody is thinking about me, okay, my being thought about that person or my being the object of that person's thought does not modify me. There's nothing, that's made different about me. There's nothing in me, that is affected or changed by my becoming a person that someone else thinks about. So if you go from not thinking about me to thinking about me, there's nothing that changes in me. I just have this Cambridge relation of being the person that you're thinking about. But there are other sorts of relations that do. So for example, if I am being, let's say, killed by you or stabbed by you or insulted by you, that does imply that something is happening in me, right? The reason why I am the one being killed is because my body is undergoing death and not someone else's. The reason why I'm the one being insulted is because my inner life is having a certain episode and not someone else's. So there are some relations that do not imply a change or a modification or anything in their subjects, but some relations do imply that. Now, if paternity and filiation do not modify the divine essence, then they become Cambridge relations. Okay, they're like the same sort of relation as being thought about. or being referred to by someone. But this undermines the reality of the distinct persons, because Cambridge relations don't produce, a real object. They don't produce a real terminus. I can think about things that don't exist. I can refer to people that are not alive anymore. So in the same way, if paternity and filiation and so on are supposed to be relations which do not modify their subject, then they're Cambridge relations. And if Cambridge relations don't produce a real terminus, in that case, there is no real distinction between father and son. Nothing is really produced by the paternity if it's a Cambridge relation. No one is really begotten if the filiation is a Cambridge relation. So here's another problem. Now, Thomas argues in Summa Theologiae, chapter 1, book 1, question 28. He says as follows. First he quotes a line from Boethius, and Boethius says, well, the relation between the persons is one that doesn't imply difference. It's like being called the same. So if I don't know if I have, let me read it more precisely. So book 1, article, or question 28. Would you show me which article is it again?
I mean, this is just, I don't know the article. This is just sort of what you...
Would you go back to the previous one? Go back to the
Yeah.
previous slide.
Yeah.
Sorry. So it's book 1, article 28, question 28, article 1. Okay, so let's go to article 1. Here's the objection. Objection 2. Further, Boethius says that relation in the Trinity of the Father to the Son and of both to the Holy Spirit is the relation of the same to the same. But a relation of this kind is only a logical one. For every real relation requires and implies in reality two terms. Therefore, the divine relations are not real relations, but only formed by the mind. Okay, and so then this next one is how Thomas replies. He says the relation signified by the term the same is a logical relation only if in regard to absolutely the same thing, because such a relation can exist only in a certain order, observed by reason, as regards the order of anything to itself, according to some two aspects thereof. The case is otherwise, however, when things are called the same, not numerically, but generically or specifically. So, for example, this cat and that cat are the same sorts of things. Thus, Boethius likens the divine relations to a relation of identity, not in every respect, but only as regards the fact that the substance is not diversified by these relations, nor as neither is it by relation of identity. So if you would go back to my previous slide. Yeah, so Thomas argues that calling things the same only rules out a real distinction, because this is the whole question, if the distinctions are really only rules out a real distinction if numerical sameness is meant. But if that's not what's meant in the case of the identity of the real relations within the divine essence, then there is multiplicity in God. So if the two relations are really distinct, paternity is really something other than filiation, then they must correspond to some distinction within God. Right, so there's simply no way around it. If we're going to attribute two distinct relations, there has to be a real distinction in the thing to which we attribute them. Just like if we say that someone punches somebody else, that's one action, one motion, let's say, one phenomenon, one event, but there is still a distinction, a real distinction between the punching and the being punched. Those are not the same. Okay, so within that one event, there is still a difference between the punching and the being punched that corresponds to the attribution of action and passion to this one event. So also, if there's going to be a real distinction between paternity and filiation, there has to be something really distinct in God to correspond to that real distinction.
Now, in relation to this point, Christian, in part of his video, he did say that what he's proposing is sort of hard to grasp, right? How you can have the essay in is identical, but the essay odd is distinct. He did mention this, so I'll just play that.
It might even seem absurd that we have this communication of the divinity, this entire incomplete communication of the divinity, and it result in real distinction. We look at certain created examples, for example, a father who has the action of begetting, which founds the relationship with a son. It's very easy to think of these two as having relations one to the other. Why? Well, because they're really distinct. This one is really distinct by its matter, and that one's really distinct by its matter. They both have human nature, but they have two different individualizations or particularizations of human nature. So it's very easy for us to think about relations one to another. But in God, We don't have this material distinction or numerical distinction between two divinities. Rather, we have the one, same, simple, united divinity. So how can we even speak of these two as distinct one to the other? It makes no sense. How can we even speak of this relation? The solution to this problem is actually quite simple, and it relies on what we discussed before concerning relation. Because if you remember, there are two aspects to relation. There's the esse in of relation, and there's the esse ad of relation. The esse ad is what forms the proper ratio of relation. So, in order for there to be a relation, there simply needs to be this order to another. While every accident has this twofold aspect of the esse in the proper ratio, relation is unique. Because when we look at all of the accidents besides relation, not only does imperfection enter into its esse in, but imperfection enters into its proper ratio. So let's take, for example, quantity. Quantity involves the idea of materiality, as we went over above. Or if we think about quality, quality is going to somehow change the subject. But relation's unique. Why is relation unique? Well, relation doesn't somehow modify the subject. Rather, relation involves simply an order to another.
Yeah,
so
stop
when
here.
it comes to all of the other...
This is the important point. He says relation does not modify the subject. That's not always true. All right, because, for example, if I'm, or at the very least, a relation does not always, how should I put this? Relation does not always imply something about the subject, but sometimes it does. So, for example, if I'm thinking about you, that doesn't imply anything about you. It doesn't change you to be thought about by me. So there is a relation there. You're the thing that I'm thinking about. But some relations are not like that. So, for example, if I strike you, right, or if I attack you, that does do something to you. Or if I'm heavier than you, that does imply something about you. And you cannot have, this whole point is that not all relations are like this. Some relations are of the sort that they don't modify their subjects, but some relations are. Strictly speaking, what are called Cambridge relations in the modern philosophy are the sort that do not imply or modify their subjects. Okay, but even a Cambridge relation always implies that some other thing has some real property. So we'll talk about that again later. But this point
so
here,
when it says like order to terminus, right? So like the essay ad is to do with like being ordered to another. So there has to be another.
Right.
To affirm this essay ad, like there has to be another then. And
correct.
I don't see that the Thomistic divine, absolutely simple divine essence, it just doesn't have the resources to provide another, right?
Correct. Yeah, because there's just a simple divine essence. That's all there is.
Yeah. That's the problem. And to talk about the divine essence being ordered to itself as the ordering to another, I mean, that's just absurd. It would
exactly, because they'll say, and this is what Thomas seems to say in that quote that I had earlier about Boethius, self relations are not real relations. They're strictly logical or conceptual. They're relations that we make with our mind, like when we say that everything is identical to itself. But that's not a relation to something else, and it's not a real relation for these guys either. A real relation has something else, right? It's a relation to something else. It implies a real distinction, and so when he says that relations don't modify their subjects, this is like certain kinds of relations don't modify their subjects, but not all of them, right? And filiation or paternity certainly do, in the ordinary sense of those words anyway.
I'm going to skip it to here. So this is sort of, he applies this framework now of relations, real relations, essay ad, essay in. He applies to Father and Son, and then you'll see what he says.
Which is the relation of the Father to the Word, and the relationship of filiation, which is the relation of the Word to the Father. These are going to be the two relations which are brought forward. But there's a difficulty, because we said that there's numerically one divinity. How can the Father and the Word be the self-same God, be the self-same divinity, have numerically the same attributes, one holiness, one goodness, one love, and so on and so forth? How can we predicate this? Well, it comes down to what we said above. There is a twofold aspect to relation, the esse in and the esse ad. We say that the Father and the Son share the same esse in. which is going to cover things like existence, love, goodness, divinity, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, we say that they are distinct in their esse ad. This is where we're going to hit our intellectual limits, because there never has been, nor will there ever be, an argument that this is impossible. There is no argument which can conclude that this is impossible. The esse in of two relations can be the same. So the divinity can be the same.
All right, I'll just pause it there. So, I mean, my objection to this would be that if the esse in of two relations are absolutely identical, then in order for their esse ad to be distinct, you have to presuppose a genuine other to make the esse ads distinct. And I don't see how the Thomists can provide that to us. What is the genuine other that will make the esse ad distinct? By virtue of what is the esse ad of the Father and the Son distinct? Because their esse in are identical. So we can't appeal to the esse in to explain why there are two distinct esse ad. We have to appeal to something else, right, to account for why the Father and the Son have distinct esse ad. And the appeal here seems to be, well, the esse ad are distinct because the Father is not the Son. But you're trying to, like, the Father not being the Son is what you are explaining by resort to distinct esse ad. So to me, that's the problem. It's sort of asking for a free lunch.
So I think there's something strange about the way that Christian phrases things. Okay, so he says that it's not contradictory to have two relations with the same esse in. That's obviously true. For example, I can be a brother and a father. All right, those relations are both in me. So there's nothing impossible about that. But can you have one and the same thing be the subject of relations that imply opposition, or whatever you want to call it, difference, right? So the father is something other than what he begets, right? A father is the father is the father of a son or an offspring, and an offspring is the offspring of a father. So can you have two relations which imply differentiation, both applying to the same thing? That's the real question. Not can you have two relations with distinct esse ad and the same esse in. In a sense, yeah, that seems obvious. Like there's nothing impossible about that. But can you have two relations which seem to exclude each other? Oppositional, sort of opposites, or I don't know the scholastic terminology, but that seem to imply differentiation with respect to esse ad in the same esse in. Not only differentiation in general, but differentiation to each other, right? So the father is the father of a son. The son is the son of a father, right? A father cannot be the same thing as a son. Otherwise, there is no paternity and filiation. But how can I be the one thing that is both father and son? The father of this son and the son of that father. That's what's the impossibility. That's what is the contradiction, because the esse ad here implies differentiation, and by identifying them in terms of esse in, there is no differentiation made at all. So the two relations imply difference, but I'm trying to say that one and the same thing is the subject of both of those relations. That's where the contradiction and the impossibility lies.
Mm-hmm. And to this comment, as someone said, I can be a father and a son at the same time. Yeah, we're not disputing that. You can be a father and son at the same time, but what makes you a father is something external to you, namely your father. Sorry, what makes you a father is something external to you, namely your son. And what makes you a son is also something external to you, namely your father. So like there's an appeal to the case of you, Stephen, we have to appeal to two entities that are external to you, right? But when it comes to like God, the Trinity, how God is Father and He is Son, I can't make an appeal to anything outside the Trinity to have these two distinct esse ad. And to me,
But you can't appeal to anything outside of the divine essence specifically.
Yeah, I cannot appeal outside the divine essence. So I cannot appeal to the Father and the Son being distinct to explain why the esse ad is distinct, because that would sort of be getting the whole thing backwards, right? The Thomist has to appeal to the esse ad being distinct to establish why the Father and the Son are distinct. So
Correct.
that's the issue I have. I actually have to get going. So Stephen, overall, do you have any sort of? I think we got through most of what you wanted to say.
Yeah.
Do you have any sort of final remarks about Thomist Trinity, and maybe recommend something for our audience to read of yours where you've sort of talked about this?
Yeah, I think there are a few things that I would recommend. In the first place, I have every now and again interaction with people who are into scholastic philosophy, and it's almost impossible to talk with them because they use technical terminology that they don't explain. Right? I am aware that in philosophy and in theology there are technical terminologies that you use in certain fields. For example, I studied phenomenology, and for many people, phenomenology is totally incomprehensible until you learn what the words means and how to use them, and then all of a sudden it becomes clear. So I don't doubt that for people who talk this way all the time, scholastic terminology can be clear to them. But to people on the outside, it's incomprehensible. And I've also found that it's actually not difficult to take that technical apparatus, that technical terminology, and to put it into ordinary English. And I try to do that in my own work. So the first thing that I would recommend for Christian, but especially his fans and appreciators who like scholastic philosophy, you need to learn how to talk about these things in ways that are simpler and without using the technical apparatus. And it's perfectly possible because, of course, we're all talking about the real world. We're talking about real things that are out there. So you can always find normal, natural language to talk about the same things. You don't have to use the terminology. And that would probably make your solutions more appealing to others, more interesting to others, invite more conversation. The second thing I want to say is that it seems to me at the end of the day, Thomas also in the Summa Theologiae, in a couple places in these questions and articles where he talks about the Trinity, he makes every now and again the concession that the words being used are not used in the ordinary sense, right? So person is not used in the ordinary sense when applied to God. Relation is not used in the ordinary sense when applied to God. I think it would be more honest and less, bullcrappy, so to speak, if you were to just say, listen, the Trinity is something that we don't understand. We don't have the right words for it. We don't have the concepts for it. We cannot make sense of it with our finite intellects. So we just have the divine, the ecclesially, the ecclesially mandated form of speech that we use, and then that's it. We don't understand really what we're talking about. If we think that we understand the Trinity, we don't understand it, which of course is Augustine's line. So whenever we're listening to a sermon about the Trinity, or we're talking to each other and we feel consolation in our hearts and spiritual edification, really because we think we understand something we've not understood, right? So I think if you actually admit this point at the end of the day, it creates trouble, because admitting that I cannot understand this thing that I have to say puts me in this strange position of, why do I have to say this in the first place, and is this really possible? But I think this would be the more honest way to go. When you have to say basically that we use these words but we don't use them in their normal sense, and we really can't picture exactly what is going on when we're talking about these things, why don't you just admit that this is a total mystery? We don't know what we're talking about. Language falls short. This is just something that we worship as a church, but but we don't understand, and there's no point in doing philosophy about it. It seems to me misleading to do a bunch of philosophy and to introduce this whole technical terminology. At the end of the day, when you get through the thick and the thickets and the bushes and the weeds, when you get down to the plain thing itself, you're come across something that can't be said and can't be made sense of. Why not just stay there from the beginning? Why introduce this whole technical apparatus and just make things complicated for no reason?
All right. Well, that's the conclusion. I hope maybe one day I'll have Dr. Stephen back. Maybe we can discuss other Trinity models, because this is the Thomists they just sort of they represent one of them. We could discuss Craig's model or Orthodox models or what have you. So thanks for coming. I thought this was very edifying. Definitely upset the Thomists in the chat, but that's sort of normal. And thank you so much. And thanks to everybody for joining us.
Thank you.